Hi, my name is Cassandra Peterson, and this is my debate for POS 364. I have chosen debate topic 2, and I have taken the stance that there is the possibility of another war between big powers. To understand the potential of another war between big powers, it is important to understand the long wave of capitalism and hegemonic cycles as two different interdependent cycles that ultimately heavily interact with one another even though they're independent. Though both are periodic waves, it is difficult to understand the complex causality. However, we know that each wave lasts approximately 80 years. Though humanity is far too complex for the cycle to be perfectly temporally regular, 80 years is the rough average with a historical range of about 60 to 100 years. Though perfect periodicity to explain humanity is impossible, there are rhythms and cycles and waves that come back, and as they come back, we experience similar social outcomes and consequences, but never the same social outcomes and consequences. What we do know, though, is the initial decades of a long wave of capitalism bring peace and prosperity, and the closing decades bring financial collapse, chaos, war, and revolution. The beginning of a new long wave of capitalism occurred in the late 1940s at the end of World War II because during World War II, the US became the global leader and hegemon through the development of information technologies that were far superior than any of our main contenders. There were several decades of relative peace and prosperity, as is typically the case during the first two-thirds of a long wave of capitalism. As has occurred in previous waves, increasing automation of jobs occurs and picks up pace throughout the cycle. This is true all the way back into the 1600s, where increasing automation looked more like steam engines and spinning jennies, to the 19th century, where increasing automation looked like interchangeable parts, and the 20th century, where you get assembly lines, electric motors, internal combustion engines, and now in the current wave, it is information technologies and cyber technologies that are automating people out of the workforce. Automation eventually causes structural unemployment that is very difficult to solve and fix. We have to go back to World War II to understand how these dynamics manifested, because it is similar at the beginning or at the transition point, and it is also similar at the end of one long wave of capitalism to the next. The dynamics are very similar at the beginning of every long wave, and the end or outcome is always the same: global war. Every aspect of the infrastructural foundations of our current cyber world were developed in World War II. It is very common during a wartime period that foundationally and fundamentally radical new sorts of technologies are developed all over the world because organizations are focused on how we can kill each other better, and productivity just goes insane, and the standard of living goes up from the competition of other nations, which leads to a rapid increase in the competitive nature of global economies. However, increasing automation gradually causes a disconnect between aggregate supply and aggregate demand. No one has figured out how to stop a credit bubble from popping once it's formed. Consequently, credit bubbles form as citizens and businesses go into debt to innovate and purchase the progressively new and amazingly attractive new technologies. This can be seen as a systematic movement, since credit bubbles inevitably lead to financial collapse. You eventually get to the point where present-based capital to both fund the level of debt and also keep economic production growing leads to financial collapse, which then leads to economic collapse, which are ultimately the direct results of credit bubbles. The technologies themselves may be specific, but the dynamics themselves are common. We have not been able to predict with any sort of effectiveness when and why and at what point human societies become bubblicious. The Fed has no good way to determine whether we're in a bubble or not, but it would make sense according to long wave capitalism theory that we are in a huge economic bubble right now and are reaching the end of the long wave of capitalism and entering into a period where global war becomes very likely at this point, because it's a systematic thing, a structural thing. It's ultimately the nature and byproduct of global human systems as they exist today. Now, what purpose does global war serve at the end of long wave capitalism? There are three main systematic purposes: the flushing out of foreign demons, bringing aggregate supply and demand back into balance, and establishing a new global pecking order for global financial governance. The first systematic purpose of global war, as I mentioned, is the flushing out of foreign demons, and it is in this period of financial instability that I described above that tends to kick off this phenomenon. Financial collapse causes people to get very upset and very scared and very uncertain, and if there's ever a space for change in society, it is during these periods of financial collapse. Governments react in fear, and in the ways they react in fear is often propagandistic at first. So after the trigger of financial collapse, you start to get the flushing out of foreign demons, which provokes global war and this tedious, torturous, and increasingly conflictual path towards war allows every nation who is trying to put a lid on protest from the outcome of financial collapse to point a finger. Each nation eventually comes to the realization that the best way to do so is to just blame outside nations for economic troubles and just all troubles. So tariffs imposed during World War II period played a very big role in this process, where tariffs were part of the buildup to the global war after financial collapse in 1929. Tariffs over a grand scale of time erodes global purchasing power. It collapses global demand because there's already a global demand problem at the end of the long wave of capitalism. And there's no way out of the economic catastrophe through tariffs. All of this ultimately creates a funnel that systematically sucks us into a global war. Which leads me to my second systematic purpose of global war, bringing aggregate supply and demand back into balance. Global war at the end of a long wave of capitalism brings aggregate demand and supply back into balance because at the end of a long wave of capitalism, the disconnect between aggregate supply and demand becomes quite severe. On one side of the economy, you have marginalized people made unnecessary to the overall functioning of the economy by automation and unemployment. On the other side of the economy, you have too much productive capacity. War gets rid of both in various ways, thereby bringing aggregate supply and demand back into balance. For example, weapons building, preparing for war, and fighting war increases aggregate demand and puts marginalized laborers back to work. This is morbid, but bombs going off decreases productive capacity, and sadly, it also eliminates reams and reams of marginalized people. The hotter the war gets and the longer it goes on, the more aggregate supply is brought back into line with aggregate demand, resetting the deck for a new round of healthy, balanced capital accumulation. Global war is ultimately necessary at the transition from one long wave to the next. Which leads me to my third systematic purpose of global war, establishing a new global pecking order for global financial governance. Remember what kicked off the period of intense conflict was financial collapse. In other words, a global financial system gone bankrupt. War becomes necessary to establish a new global pecking order when nations come to realize which nations are going to have the most say in what the new global financial and economic order is going to look like, and most importantly, which nations it will most benefit. At the end of long wave of capitalism, imbalances built up over time lead to contradictory economic interests and conflictual posturings over markets across the globe's major powers. Global war is about proving strength by mastering important and far-flung regional resource domains while also having enough already accumulated resources to front war efforts at whatever level required to master more. In the final analysis, the outcome depends on who fights smartest and hardest, along with a hefty dose of historical happenstance and luck. But what is clear eventually at the close of every global war is this: those nations whose governmental, productive, and financial systems make most effective and powerful use of the key novel innovative technologies of that day, they tend to win. Eventually, victors emerge, order is restored, the global financial system is reconstituted on a sound basis, and a new long wave of capitalism begins. Which leads me to pivot towards the hegemonic cycle and hegemonic stability theory. The hegemonic cycle is an associated and temporally similar cycle that moves the focus from capitalism itself to the global superpower, also known as the hegemon. Hegemons have risen and fallen since the 16th century, with the rhythms of the long waves of capitalism often propelling current hegemons to decline as new potential hegemonic nations arise. Hegemons are global superpowers, and there is only one hegemon in each global long wave of capitalism. But during a transition to a new long wave, you often get hegemonic battles. In this cycle, the main hegemonic challenger is, of course, China. You can have the same hegemon, but every transition through multiple long waves to the new hegemon has occurred at the end of a long wave through this process of global war. When you have a great understanding of these rhythms, you have a much better understanding of historical rhythm and pacing of the globe, and it helps in various ways to better understand this. Hegemonic stability theory argues that the global system is disordered and anarchic, and in order for humanity to obtain global coordination toward ever greater and better production, leading to ever rising standards of living, which ultimately benefit humanity, a global order keeper must rise to the height of the international system and bring order to it and maintain that order. This benefits the hegemon in innumerable ways, as well as humanity, but there are, of course, costs. Of course, the global system is set by and forth by the global hegemon, and so wealth and power flow to the hegemon through those political, economic, and financial systems. The cost of being the global policeman and order keeper, I think, is abundantly apparent to every American. Either we have a hegemon or we have chaos. Either we have a hegemon or we have global war. There has been several centuries where you have a hegemon and there's been some sort of hegemonic challenge going on. Much like with the long cycle of capitalism, humanity is far too complex and context dependent for the hegemonic cycle to be periodically regular or close. As such, there is much debate regarding precise dating for hegemonic rise and fall and the ways in which the hegemonic cycle interacts with the long cycle of capitalism. We can be sure, though, that the likelihood of global war is very, very prominent. Thank you for watching.